So I'm Kathleen Murphy, and on behalf of the Women in STEM Cooperative, welcome to our original online series about expanding the participation of women in undergraduate STEM education. Today's focus is inclusive learning spaces. About us, the Women in STEM Cooperative consists of a group of volunteers dedicated to advancing women in STEM in our respective communities at the University of Buffalo and Cornell University. This series is our attempt to address some of the systemic challenges and opportunities with improving student STEM success. Before we invite today's distinguished panel to get started, we'd like to take this moment to welcome you, our guests. Over 130 of your colleagues representing 56 institutions of higher education and 8 other organizations from 4 countries, 1 territory, and 25 states registered for this entire series, even though they're not all with us today. If you are joining us today, please say hello in the chat room and tell us where you're from as I introduce Patrice Presco, my series co-chair from Cornell University. Over to you, Patrice.
Thanks, Kathleen. And I just want to start off by telling those of you that are Springsteen fans, I'm still on a high as I saw Springsteen on Broadway last night in New York City. So in addition to sharing out knowledge and information about how we can better help STEM students thrive, one of our goals for these sessions is really to help build a community. And so part of that process is giving you the opportunity to click on somebody else's image and start in conversation and get to know other people who might be struggling with similar issues or have solutions to problems that you're working on. So one of the things that Chris from Shindig will show us in a few minutes is a short video showing you how you can interact with our distinguished speakers. Some ways that you can do that are through raising your hand to come up on stage or posting a question. So Chris, do you want to show that that video now, and then we will have a quick icebreaker and I will introduce the speakers. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, there is a hand where it says raise a hand. If you click on that, you'll have the opportunity to come up on stage where Kathleen and I are, and then you can ask your question to the speaker and have a conversation with them. So I really hope that you take advantage of that because we would like this to be an interactive session. The other thing that you can do is click on the circle where it says ask. And if you type your question in there, we will put that up on stage and then our speakers can respond to that question. You also have the opportunity to interact with the people that are in the room with you if you want to have a chat on the side with them. And if you would like to meet somebody else, all you have to do is click on their image. And when your images are attached, the 2 or 3 of you that are attached together can actually have your own conversation, and only you can hear that conversation, no one else. So as a way to break the ice a little bit and hopefully give you a chance to reach out and meet some new people, we're going to play a very quick icebreaker bingo. So Chris, if you can put that slide up for us, we're going to give you about 2 to 3 minutes to try and find some people that have the qualities on the bingo slide. So what we'd like you to do is take a look at the bingo options and then please just click on someone's image and see if you can find 4 people that meet these 4 qualities.
Patrice, what do they get if they win?
They get the honor of being announced that they're the winner.
Awesome.
And a free recording of this session. Yeah, yep. They can have their own. They can have their own free Shindig session. Okay, I think that we are going to start moving along because we have a lot of really, really great information to fit in. Like I said, if you did find 4 people who met those criteria, please feel free to type it into the Ask a Question and we will put you up on screen to let everybody know. And if you are using Twitter, we wanted to let you know that you can use the hashtag STEMStudentsThrive to continue a conversation on Twitter as well. So I would like to introduce our 4 speakers. Jean Narum will be our first speaker, and she is the principal at Learning Spaces Collaboratory. After she speaks, we will bring up Lisa Stevens, the senior strategist at SUNY Academic Innovation University at Buffalo, and Rebecca Rotundo, who is an instructional technology specialist, also at University at Buffalo. And Lisa actually is on the Cornell campus today, so we're really happy to be hosting her here today. And then we will have Sheen Lee, the Associate University Librarian at Cornell University, and Camille Andrews, who is an Emerging Literacies Librarian also at Cornell University. So with that, Chris, if you could bring up our first speaker, please, we will go ahead and get started.
Greetings, everyone. Chris is going to do the PowerPoint for me so he can put the first photo up. And I'm Jeannie Narum. As I was introduced, the principle of the learning space is collaboratory, and I'm going to give you kind of the history of how I got into the world of thinking about learning spaces. I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in this conversation about why space matters, because that's been dear to my soul for many, many years, and especially the conversation about why it matters in the context of increasing enrollments of women in STEM fields, becoming STEM majors, and ensuring their persistence, motivation, and success. And you'll probably hear me saying those three words a lot, because that's all what we've been about in Project Kaleidoscope for many years. And I'm particularly pleased to be sharing this conversation with my colleagues at FlexSpace, because our efforts are so complementary. So set the stage. Here's a brief introduction to me in the learning spaces collaboratory. My journey into the world, next slide, or moving forward, next slide, Chris. Into the world of planning spaces for learning began in the late 1980s. You can see how old I am by looking at the color of my hair. Under the umbrella of an NSF-funded initiative that became Project Kaleidoscope, and many of you who reside in the US, I hope you know about PCAL. Some of you know the status of undergraduate STEM learning in the US in the mid-1980s, which was described in at least one national report as dismal. Enrollments of undergraduate STEM math and engineering students, I should have said science and math, there was no STEM then, were drastically declining. Thus, enrollments in PhD programs in science and engineering were dropping drastically. That situation led to a series of national reports analyzing the current status and recommending that NSF address the problem. In 1989, NSF acted on that recommendation and asked me to assemble a group of leaders from predominantly undergraduate institutions to draft recommendations for policies, programs, and budgets that would drive NSF undergraduate initiatives into the future. We spent an 18-month grant period in examining current practices, gathering data about what works and what did not, particularly from those persons who at that time we identified as scouts, those pioneering at the edges, looking into the future, imagining and piloting new approaches to strengthen undergraduate learning. And we prepared a national report, which was presented to the National Science Foundation and the larger community at the National Academy of Sciences in 1992. Both the 92 report and the 1992 colloquium gave attention to physical spaces for accommodating STEM learning and research in the undergraduate setting, how they should be planned, how attention to physical spaces should be given into attention to larger institutional strategies undertaken to strengthen student learning in STEM fields. That spaces mattered had become very clear to us early on in our deliberations. As we analyzed the work of pedagogical pioneers, we learned about the value of undergraduate research, about working in teams in classrooms, as well as labs, about giving students the experience of learning by doing, and giving students responsibility for their own learning. We also gathered further evidence about the dismal state of undergraduate learning spaces for learning. Those reports sparked national attention at NSF and on campuses across the country, giving attention to how the work of pedagogical pioneers could be adapted elsewhere. Long story, that's where we began in 1992. Some of you may still have spaces that look like that. There was no opportunity for students to do science as science is done, to really take ownership of their own learning. Parallel with attention to how learning happens and how pedagogical, programmatic, and institutional change happens, we gave attention to where learning happens and how planning for learning happens. The first facilities workshop was planned in 1992, the fall, right after we announced our report. And it was the first in a long series of over 800 workshops, colloquia, and roundtables over many years addressing issues related to planning learning spaces, events in which teams from over 800, as I mentioned, college and universities, and countless architects participated. And this is very important because from the very first, all the conversations we had about transforming learning spaces involved conversations between architects and academics. And one of the wonderful things that happened out of that was the architects learned more about the kind of experiences the students were supposed to have in the space, and the academics learned more about how the architects thought how they planned spaces, what they thought about the experience of the learning. This became an amazing national community of practice, bridging communities of academics and architects to share best practices. In 2010, I retired from Project Kaleidoscope and established the Learning Spaces Collaboratory with the intent and aspiration, I must admit, to maintain the momentum of focusing on the future of planning undergraduate learning spaces at the national level, with greater attention to the future of learning and planning. It seems like deja vu from the earlier days of Project Kaleidoscope, and we were kind of examining what needs to happen now in order to inform and shape the future. And I think it also resonates with these communities that you have gathered and are concerned about women in STEM fields, about now today about the impact of space, experience of space on learners and on learning. Let me share with you two stories from my experiences over 2 decades in the world of facilities. First, a set of lessons learned about making and integrating attention to the physical environment, hoping to prompt thoughts and actions on your own campuses to advance your efforts to increase persistence and success of women in STEM, and in their joy of becoming part of the community. And I think that's one of the things we're learning from campuses that work, that it becomes a joyful community, a community of practice. The second set of stories is about LSE roundtables, a recent experimental strategy that I developed to understand what focusing on the future meant in the context of planning learning spaces. First, one final lesson learned. Much of what I talk about is not rocket science. Planning spaces is no different from planning other major change initiatives. But from analyzing reports and facilities workshops, even those beginning in 1992, we learned that, next slide please, what works in getting the spaces right is an informed community. And this is taken exactly out of the book we wrote, as a community that we wrote, a guidebook to planning learning spaces in 1995. So from 1989 to the work we did in examining what campuses were doing, for pedagogical change, programmatic change, as well as facilities change, this always became the kind of driving principle of campuses that work. The What Works guide was the first major planning facilities for undergraduate science facilities book I think ever written. And it captures the essence of stories from campuses involved with facilities. And from analyzing their stories and data, we learned that spaces that work for students now and into the future were spaces that emerged from the efforts and aspirations of stakeholders in many spheres of responsibility. And this is why I want to emphasize again the importance of the Project Kaleidoscope workshops, which were began, and I had their essence in the kind of the experience of the learner, the pedagogies, were enriched by the conversations that included conversations about how the space matters. So I'm going to start with kind of a prelude to my first bit of advice, that the community matters. My first story is from the experience of Robin Wright. Some of you may be aware of the transformation at the University of Minnesota into a national and now internationally recognized leader in active learning spaces. Perhaps some of you have attended their summer workshops. The impetus for their work were discussions between Robin Wright, a biology faculty member now at the National Science Foundation, and a facilities officer at the university. Discussions that were sparked by Robin's need for a pedagogical sandbox, and Jeremy's response was, why not? And it was a response that reflected the emerging university plan's attention-wide to 21st century classrooms. Among their first steps were a series of audits, getting a clear picture of student persistence and success, looking at students with different backgrounds and more, establishing benchmark for measuring progress to be able to make the case along the way as spaces still became open to, available for transformation, to make the case that indeed space does matters to the quality of learning of STEM. So, so Robin's advice when she talks to me about this is how they got going. Her advice is always start small, dream big. Dream big, start small. And so that's kind of the theme that is woven into my remarks today. A similar historical story comes from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which many of you know is a historically Black institution. The Dean of Chemistry at UMBC, Bill LaCourse, not anticipating repurposing classrooms, but he was puzzling over the precipitous drop of declared STEM chemistry majors after their first year. Bill reports that after much reflection, thinking about the student experience, talking with students and everything, he determined that space was the problem. And he said, how could anyone understand what becoming a chemist could be when they're learning and listening and doing in our spaces? And so, and this, of course, at UMBC was a particularly institutional concern. And both the Minnesota story and the UMBC story are the kind of examples from which you can distill what happens when an institution takes institutional responsibility for the quality of the spaces, not just a single faculty member or a single group of faculty members or a facilities officer. But what I learned and what I've learned from the many, many hundreds of stories I've received back from campuses involved with PCAL facilities, this is still PCAL now, PCAL facilities initiatives were these, next slide please, or moving on, was what the institutions, what they need to do is audit. There's a whole lot of material, information you need to know as you think about transforming spaces to accommodate 21st century learners and nurture their learning. And so think about, what do you know what's on your, so these are 5 bullets and I'm going to go quickly through them, but you can look at them. So what do you know about on your campus? Know what information is already available on your campus about persistence, success, and motivation, or lack thereof. Determine targets for doing better, assemble current data, or gather new data. Given the wisdom and history of this network, working together on your campus as a network or within the broader networks here, I assume such information is available and already driving your work. But this is baseline information for building and continuing to make the case why certain strategies and practices should be considered when thinking about spaces. Why does space matter? Second, know your strategic initiatives, ongoing or anticipated, institutional or departmental, are driving change on your campus. Many years ago, a savvy provost on a campus anticipating a new STEM building, but with no recent history in major facilities projects, called me up and said what worked for her was to appoint one member of her superb facilities planning team to each of the major institutional standing committees. She wanted to make certain that questions something like this: will the decision this committee, maybe faculty development, whatever, are considering will have any impact on our planning for a new STEM building? Now, you can make the link between faculty development and facilities development, but she wanted to make sure that all major committees or keep the question about would space matter, how does space matter, on their table. Such a question could be adapted to prompt campuses to consider how decisions being made about spaces serve an institutional goal to increase percentage and persistence of women entering into and proceeding in STEM fields on your campus. Think about how such a question might influence discussions. At the very least, someone might ask, why does it matter? Others might ask for evidence that spaces make a difference. Go back to the University of Minnesota example. At the very least, an interesting back and forth discussion might ensue. Next, know how people on your campus as individuals and as members of departments, facilities offices, assessment offices, teaching learning centers, understand how spaces influence the learning experience. Influences how learners see themselves as part of a STEM community of practice. Some years ago, I was on an architectural consulting team, a 2-day trip to a major research university. We spent the first day in sessions about setting goals and about all the things I've been speaking about before, and establishing an agenda for planning based on agreed goals for learning for their students, all students, not just STEM majors. At the beginning of the second day, we all walked through the existing science building. During the tour, the biology chair commented, "I've taught here more than 30 years, and I have never before even thought about the message that these spaces send to students. I came here," still commenting, "as a student intending to be a biology major. I now look at these hallways from quite a different perspective, the perspective of my students today, who are quite different from the students of my day." Another story. A PCAL colleague, a new dean on a new campus, on a Hispanic serving institution, and another savvy dean, I must say, reported that one of her first initiatives on campus during her first month was to walk around her buildings with a senior staff member in her division and take photos of all potential soft spaces, spaces that would send a new, welcoming message to all students that this is a space where they belong. This approach is congruent with something I always paraphrase from the National Research Council report, Crossroads, Excellence and Equity, which really is a kind of a major research resource I'm sure all of you are familiar with when you're interested in these issues. This is a quote, it's my paraphrase. "What works is when students walk by or through a building, looking into a particular place, seeing learning and doing happening, and becoming aware that this is a community she would like to belong to. This is what she sees them doing, and she sees herself becoming that herself," which gets back to the reflections from the biology chair in the earlier story. Know also what makes a brain-changing space. Now, I'm putting together kind of a whole list of things that you as working committees and individuals that perhaps on your campus can kind of do to lay the groundwork for major attention to learning spaces. Many years ago in a day-long seminar on renovation of STEM spaces, which was co-sponsored by VentureWell, which some of you know is the national organization preparing engineers, innovators, and entrepreneurs, preparing students to be that, to be the problem solvers of the future. Now, this takes a particular kind of space, and we knew that most campuses don't have opportunity or funds to make major renovations, to make major renovations and new construction. So the whole seminar that day was involved with how do you renovate current spaces to kind of accommodate your new vision of spaces that really entice students to become learners. So we call them brain-changing spaces. So we suggest that, and we've got a long audit list, it's on the LSC website, of questions you should take a group around your campus and ask the what makes this a brain-changing space. So examine the space, just like the new dean with her senior staff person can look at your spaces from a different perspective, and why would anybody want to be in this space? And other questions included in that audit that we prepared with VentureWell was, what do you like about the spaces for learning and teaching that you have now? What don't you like? What would you like to do in your spaces that you cannot do? And for students and faculty alike, what was your best learning experience? It's not that you have to use that particular audit questionnaire, but I encourage you to think about gaining a really sense of the way your community thinks about current spaces, how they work to serve your goals for enhancing the persistence and success, I'm using that again, of all students, but particularly women students. So that's the history of PCAL. I'm giving you these suggestions, but develop a formal structure and a formal process, and a understanding that this is not a 3-month shot before you're thinking of making major changes, but it comes embedded into the process of changing pedagogy, changing programs, and changing spaces, and doing faculty development. So it all becomes woven together into a single set. Next slide, please. So that's the quick history of Project Kaleidoscope. And bridge to the LSC comes next. About 3 years ago, would you change the slide, please? So we, when I moved into the LSC in 2010, bringing all the wonderful lessons learned and connections and kind of inspirations from the architects and academics with whom I had worked for almost 20 years, I kept the facility stuff with me because it's so intriguing, and because I think attention to spaces is building community in two ways. It builds community during the planning process, and it really nurtures and shapes community into the future. And, if you've got something in concrete, you can't knock it down and get it over again. You can maybe change the way you develop faculty or the evolution of programs, but spaces really matter. So I moved into the LSC, and we sat down with a weekend with some really oddball pioneers, and we spent a weekend figuring out what questions should be asked now if you're thinking about renewing, repurposing, building new learning spaces. And we spent a weekend, and we came up on the first day only with the first questions. What do we want our learners to become? And then you can see the three questions there, and the fourth question we had was, how do you assess what you're doing? So you can see those photos there are quite different than the earlier photos that I showed from 1989. And the upper right is from the University of Minnesota. That's a kind of a snapshot into their active learning classroom. The top on the left, that's the problem-driven learning room at Georgia Tech, and all of these are the science students taking responsibility for their own learning. The Georgia Tech room, where they can kind of put their ideas and feelings and thoughts and conclusions and questions up on the board for critique in a room, which includes a table for 8 people. And the bottom one, which I love, this is not on a college campus, but it's from Carthage College. And during the January interim, their students go down to Johnson Space Center. So what has happened on their campus is preparing them for the kind of world and career beyond the campus that they want, the community they want to be a part of. There are 2 women there. I think it's a lovely, lovely photo. But I sat down in 2016, and I thought, this is really interesting. And I was bored. I was not bored, never bored, puzzled and frustrated that there was not a kind of a progress in thinking about on campuses about how space matters anymore. They were kind of saying, that's a good building, we'd like that kind of building. And that was true, even though the widespread big thinking about spaces for learning, and you'll see some of those in the flex space conversation. My frustration was that audacious questions were no longer driving the planning process on campus. And reflecting my PCAL experience, so I orchestrated a series of roundtables in which pioneering thinkers, academics, and architects came together just like in 1989 and could imagine how to shape the future for institutions and students in the process of giving attention to learning spaces. Roundtable groups, there were 11. I think you can go to the next slide, please.
And Jean, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it's been about 20 minutes, and we wanted to make sure that we allow the same amount of time for the other.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we will have time for Q&A at the end, so stick around because we'll bring all the speakers up on the stage at the end.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this. More to come.
Okay,
bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we're going to bring up Lisa and Rebecca from University at Buffalo, where they will talk about the flex spaces that they've been working on. And I wanted to remind everyone that you do have the opportunity to come up on stage and ask a question. So please feel free to raise your hand and Chris will bring you up on stage. Or if you want to type a question that to be asked, you can just type it in the little ask a question box.
So hello, everyone. I'm Rebecca Rotundo. I work as an instructional technology specialist at the University of Buffalo. A little background on me. I am recently into the higher ed learning design world. I was a K-12 teacher. I worked with adult refugees. My teaching and learning spaces were eclectic, to say the least, a lot of community centers with no technology and tables and chairs and pens and pencils. So it was a real big change for me to come into the university and higher ed system. And luckily, I have Lisa Stevens on campus, and FlexSpace has helped me tremendously in coming up to speed and understanding how to put together good teaching and learning and good, well-designed spaces. That is actually Lisa's presentation, but that's okay. Chris, if you don't mind, that's Lisa's. So I have a different presentation. But I'm going to talk a little bit about active learning, universal design for learning, and how it can all come together combined with good space design to really help students who are minority students, struggling students, and how those things can help keep them in classes, in their programs. So active learning, which most people know, I'm just going to review it really quick, is anything that involves the students taking a role in their own learning, participating in activities, reflecting on their learning. So anything that's not a traditional lecture would be active learning. If you think about something like an English class where you have to do the reading outside of class and you come and have a discussion, active learning. The goals of active learning are to help students develop these higher order skills that they need for the workplace, skills like collaboration, thank you, that's the one, collaboration, communication, reasoning, data analysis, that's the one, Chris, thank you. Self-reliance, initiative, problem solving. Often active learning activities are ideally project-based, and ideally they would be, they would have to pull students different skills. So what we're trying to do is replicate a modern workplace that is generally project-based and cross-functional. So we want them to have these, to get these skills while they're learning these discrete skills that the specific information of each program. Active learning values learners over students. They value facilitators versus instructors, collaborative work over isolated work, engagement over attendance, application over assignment. They prefer, the goals are exploration, and activities that allow students to discover and apply concepts. So this is what the active learning goals are. What we found in the research is effective teaching for minority students aligns with the goals of active learning. There are 12 key elements for effective teaching, but only 3 of them are really relevant here. That schools provide academically challenging curriculum that includes attention to the development of these higher order cognitive skills, that instruction focuses on student creation. They create their own meaning of the content in an interactive and collaborative learning environment, and that students see these learning tasks as meaningful learning tasks. So you can see how these goals all start to align. Now, in K-12, we approach this through universal design for learning. So as schools started to recognize that their learners are heterogeneous, you've heard of different learning styles, they've been trying to research and address this. So we've been trying to develop these pedagogical approaches that are appropriate for the inclusion of all learners. They need to structure not just the educational and the social environment so that these students develop these skills and attitudes so that they can interact across their perceived differences. So this is all sort of set into the framework of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning provides a blueprint. Oh yeah, there you go. Sorry, a little out of order, but that's my fault. So here's a quick overview of universal design for learning, the learning guidelines. There are 3 main areas. There's engagement, representation, and action and expression. And really, this is just a rabbit hole of information. If you're interested in the psychology of learning, it's fascinating to me, at least. But this is sort of the framework it's set in. What we try and do is create instructional goals, methods, materials, and assessments that work for everyone. And it's not about the old way of sort of adding on content that is appropriate or like pulling a student out and helping them with some specialized material. The idea is that all of the curriculum, all the activities, and all the goals are designed so that there's multiple access points, there's multiple methods, and there's multiple results, but they all achieve the same goal. In this way, learners can approach the learning through their own path instead of sort of saying, oh, Steve, you need this special thing over here. Research is finding that this universal design for learning, it's based on neurosciences and our understanding of how the brain learns. Hang on, gotta flip over my notes. So when we put universal design for learning, which aligns with the goals, so there's another model, and this will be available to you after, of sort of universal design for learning and how they approach it. So there's the now what, the experience, the what, and the so what. So that would be the reflection. Why are we doing this? How are we applying it? What is the experience, the actual learning experience? So we have active learning, we have universal design for learning. We put these together and we add in a flipped classroom approach. So it's really common in active learning for faculty to say, you know, these experiences that we're building in the classroom take up a lot of time. This time before was lecture. I could sort of fire hose information to everyone. It's very efficient. How can I lecture and build in these activities? So what we do is we recommend the flipped classroom model. So the flipped classroom model is simply the discrete information is done at home and the homework or the learning experiences happen in the classroom. It takes a little bit of a lift up front for instructors, but most of them find that it's really a more effective way of teaching. The discrete knowledge doesn't change that much from semester to semester, so they don't have to recreate these videos. But then the students come to class and they're able to give them the learning experiences that are more engaging. And they're also, it frees up some space for just-in-time teaching. They can really work with the students one-on-one. It's almost like the students are doing their homework with the instructor and TAs available. Of course, we need learning spaces designed to support this sort of learning. I want to talk about one class that I helped to flip, and we took advantage of a newly designed classroom. It's Calc 141. So a pretty difficult class. It's a freshman first semester class. It's a requirement for hundreds of students here at UB. And it's, you know, traditionally a real challenge, especially for women and minority students. So what we did was we re-engineered the class to be a flipped class. So the teacher took all their lectures and made videos, put them online. When they came to class, students were put into groups. They were in these groups all semester, but midway through the semester, they were given the option to change groups, and the instructor put them together in groups that were thoughtful. She took some very simple demographic information, GPA, and where they're from, what their native language was, what their gender is, and what their major is. And then at the midway point, also looked and identified some groups that weren't working together and mixed them up. So every day the students came to class, they took a really short quiz just to make sure that they had done the work, a little assessment. And then they did a group work homework that they had to turn in one homework that would count for the whole group. And there were also game activities. And we were lucky in that we got her scheduled in a classroom that had movable, just simple chairs with the fold down chairs, but they were movable. So the students could really easily just turn around and be in groups. And then the walls had whiteboards on them. So those students would get up, and when they were trying to explain stuff, they would, you know, draw on the whiteboards and do all that. And what we found was we don't have the grades back because that was just fall, but we surveyed the students, and far and away, there were fewer drops, there were fewer failures. We do know that. And the students really enjoyed the class. They said that the classwork, the group work, and having the instructor available was far and away the most useful part of the course. The second most useful was the videos. And what we did was we looked at the videos and how the students were using them. And what we found that students were watching them multiple times, going back to multiple points, And they were also watching them at a slower speed. Some of them were watching them fast, some were watching slow. So what we extrapolated from that was students who have language issues or might have some sort of learning issues were able to basically watch the lecture over and over and over. They were able to slow down the English. So this is how we sort of put together the active learning to support these learners who need a little more support. Okay, so that's sort of some flip learning. We do know, and the first slide shows the research that was done for, what was it, a biology course, Lisa, at a biology course about how flipped learning and active learning in these spaces really improves learning at the low end of things. But what's really critical, the takeaway, I know, just one second, the takeaway of this is that the spaces have to go with the pedagogy. There has to be that stakeholder, you have to get all of the stakeholders together. It can't just be learning space redesign. You have to get the instructors on board and the curriculum redesigned. Is that my time?
Yep. Thank you, Rebecca. Now we'll hear from Lisa.
Yeah. Get the instructors on board, the facilities managers, the architects, the AVIT integrators. Just a few extra folks on board. Thanks, Rebecca. Rebecca went to the hockey game last night. You know, Patrice was hanging out with Springsteen. I was just toiling away. It's good to see everybody. I'm really jazzed to be here. It's ironic that my home campus is the University of Buffalo, and yet here I am today. I'm feeling very comfortable tucked into the corner of a little television studio here at Cornell, and it'll be good to visit with people. It's good to be back on the campus here. And I certainly want to thank Jeannie and all of our colleagues at the Learning Space Collaboratory. We are truly standing on the shoulders of giants with all the work that went into that. I see Rich is out there at Stanford, and an awful lot of people have been working and toiling in this for years. As a senior strategist in academic innovation, I'm often tasked with integrating theory into practice. And I want to reference the slide here because, in particular, how are we going to effectively integrate space, technology, and pedagogy to increase the effectiveness of teaching and learning? And a lot of the deans and faculty that I'm talking with these days are really concerned about how to pack, at the speed of the internet, 4 years of learning, or actually closer to probably 5.5 or 6 years worth of learning into this 4-year box. They have to make a lot of hard choices about how to get the right information in. Our system of higher education works well in this country, but it is often not real agile when it comes to adopting new teaching and learning practices at the speed of the internet. So how can we start to use learning analytics, simulation tools, and better space design to decrease the amount of time that's required to learn while increasing the quality of that learning? Next slide, please. So the historical Black colleges like Smith, Barnard, Mount Holyoke. Hey, Chris, you got another slide there? Oh, I see boxes moving, so I bet we do. Thank you. So the private schools that play to more narrowly tailored audiences of learners have long figured out that you can get an increase of excellence in their learning. We know that same gender education, particularly at the middle school level, is going to be more effective with adolescent girls. When we place adolescent girls in safe spaces, supportive spaces that they can foster respectful and energetic inquiry, they learn better. So how do we take those lessons learned and apply them to larger, diverse public and private universities? We know that in the sausage-making machine that we have to have learners with good background in education, good SAT, ACT scores, but then at the other end, there has to be that credential, the currency of that degree, in order for them to be effective in either graduate school or in the workplace. And put even more simply, institutions can't afford to turn out a bad product. So we know that analytics and a lot of the new tools that are available to us now help to personalize education. but it's difficult to adopt personalized learning at this point of time. But we're starting to see an increase toward personalized learning and competency-based education based on how we can better leverage the data coming in from a lot of these tools. Next slide, please. Rebecca already spoke to this slide, so I'm not going to hang on this much. But again, Jeannie talked about the University of Minnesota and Jeremy and the efforts out with that team in the new Brunix building, and that's just amazing. And the amount of value that they place on the technology mediated classrooms. Chris did a nice job of gathering all that data, and now we're seeing report after report come in that amplifies and reinforces that active learning works. Coulter, Walker, and Brooks later produced an article that was playfully entitled, "It's Not You, It's the Classroom," where they replicated those control groups and again illustrated the gains. And as Rebecca talked about, the highest gains that you see are from the students that are most at risk. So we can also tease out non-technology intensive factors from that research and look to implement those into active learning classrooms, and they're going to likely produce similar results. You don't need to have all the sexy technology there. Next slide, please, although it is nice to have. So I want to talk just a bit about the new medical school that we built at the University of Buffalo, which has very effectively integrated a lot of those new tools, particularly active learning. We have the opportunity to showcase some of our classrooms where they have integrated technology and pedagogy at scale. The top floor of this new building integrates simulations, visualization tools, surgical robotics, and a traditional cadaver lab where students learn in a team-based environment. So we think that's really doing a lot to reinforce the efforts that the university has put in across interprofessional education, which of course is in part being driven by the accrediting agencies, but it just makes good sense because we know that the results and the data are backing up these particular use of these tools and practices. Next slide, please. So the challenge is, how are we going to translate all this theory and evidence into feet on the ground practice? And Jeannie and Rebecca have highlighted a lot of that evidence of how it works, but how are we going to gain some of those efficiencies? Well, we can continue to investigate where the data takes us. Candace Tilley from Stanford and formerly from the Open Learning Initiative said, you know, the beauty of the online learning that's been out there for the last 20 years is that it's really doing a lot to make teaching and learning transparent, particularly learning. As a result, we've got cognitive scientists, instructional designers, faculty, and academic technologists mapping and connecting how we learn that course material. We can be more purposeful in our approach and make that content more personalized. Gamification, serious play, has certainly been in use for decades in healthcare and in the military. So with technology becoming increasingly consumerized, the cost is coming down and we're seeing more adoption in the classroom. It's becoming a little more affordable. And finally, nobody likes to feel, stupid or awkward or incompetent, especially when they're early in the learning curve, be it a faculty member or a learner. So we can design space thoughtfully that produces a better sense of security, in particular through use of simulations. Next slide, please. But again, the key isn't necessarily the sexy technology. The key is about designing the space that leverages a lot of the active learning techniques that are going to be displayed right there. And it's about how do you get the faculty to adopt those practices and how do you ensure that the space can make constructive use of all of those practices. Next slide, please. I'm keeping Chris really busy. And this is one of my favorite slides to show because here we are here we are on the next slide, where we are increasingly learning and understanding how all this works. We're getting the data that describes how to better and more effectively integrate technology right at the time that higher education is being challenged financially. So tuition and fees are going up, state appropriations are going down. And if anybody, I always plug Jeff Salino's College Unbound, because I think that book does an excellent job of describing the current state of higher education and some very real solutions that are out there and available to us now if we can be more effective in learning how to utilize some of them. Next slide. So with that in mind and thinking about how can we be more efficient, how can we do a better job of teaching and learning, how can we decrease the amount of time that learners spend in the classroom or use that time effectively with flipped classrooms, there's two free tools out there available in higher education. We can continue to build communities of practice through conference attendance, although some of that's been pared back with the cost of conferences. We can certainly make better use of webinars and literature. We can have better use of focused social media. But the Learning Space Rating System is a really nice tool to go in and get a baseline measure at your campus of the learning potential within a particular environment. It's very quantitative in its design. It's a great way to put some numbers that have some meaning and then be able to benchmark with some other campuses. Rich has been a part of that team for a long time, so he may want to come up on stage in a bit and comment a little bit more. The other tool would be FlexSpace, which is a little bit more qualitative, certainly more descriptive, tying a lot of attributes, room attributes, to a specific record. And we have space in there to also include Learning Space Rating System scores, and those two systems will be getting stitched together, I think, a little more efficiently in the future. Next slide, please. So here is just a quick screenshot of what the Learning Space Rating System looks like. It's based on an Excel spreadsheet, and you can mark yourself off with certain credits with the attributes in the classroom and assign a score. It's very much designed like the LEED environmental rating system. You know, everybody's seen a building that's certified LEED Platinum, LEED Gold, LEED Silver. Similar. So you assign those credits and you can get a baseline score of your learning potential in those spaces. We have found it anecdotally inside SUNY really useful at prioritizing, you know, the space rehab dollars. We can look at a whole body of classrooms and then say, okay, these need the attention first, and then we can prioritize down a little bit more as funding becomes available. Next slide, please. So this next slide is all about world peace. We know that ideally in a shared governance structure, you want to have, going back to the opening slide with the three big circles overlapping, you want to have your faculty at the table. You want to have students at the table. You certainly want to have your facilities and space planners and your AVIT integrators at the table. But oftentimes that planning happens in a linear fashion rather than a collaborative, integrated fashion. So next slide, please. That was the foundation for FlexSpace. The SUNY provost walked into an advisory meeting one day and said, you know, we're spending millions and millions of dollars just across the SUNY system. Can we share our records more effectively across the system? We prototyped a couple of solutions about how to share photographs and how to describe taxonomies that are specific to the facilities and architects, planners, that group that's looking at a space through the lens of their expertise. Another taxonomy for the AV-IT integration community. And then yet a third taxonomy for our faculty, our academic technologists, librarians, instructional designers, to look at the attributes of those rooms and benchmark against peers, and it's all coupled to pictures of those classrooms. Next slide. So I'm really excited to show a couple of screenshots of what our new tool is looking like. We are in the middle of migrating from the original FlexSpace tool now over to a custom portal that's being built as I speak. We hope to have some activity on that for at least view only of all of you who have already contributed records. You'll be able to search those records and have early filtering about the middle of January. Next slide, please. And for anyone that wants to go in and look at different spaces by different taxonomies, different filters, different terms, you can search on spaces by the type of space. You can search on spaces by the pedagogies that are implemented in those rooms or particular curriculum. And then you can also look at traditional measures of square footage, things of that nature. So I see my time is up. If Chris can flip through a couple more of those screenshots, I almost got in under the wire.
All right. Thanks so much, Lisa. And if with your permission, we can share those slides with the people that have registered for the event so they can have access to them and follow up with you on any questions they might have.
You betcha.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so now I'd like to welcome Camille and Sheen, who are going to talk with us about a makerspace project at Cornell, as well as an upcoming portal project. And if you look in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you should see two widgets, one that says portal video and one that says shared studio video. And if you click on either of those widgets, it will actually bring up a short video with a little bit of additional information. And now I leave it to Camille and Sheen. Thank you.
Thank you. And so basically, I'm the Emerging Literacies Librarian at Mann Library, which is the largest science library at Cornell University. And I'm just here to talk to you a little bit about a makerspace project that we've been involved in. So next slide, please. And so for those of you who might not know, this is, I think, a really good definition of makerspaces done by Alyssa Krosky, a librarian. And what I really like about it is that it gets at the basics of makerspaces, so that, you know, it's a space for making things. But it also gets at, I think, some of the things that I think are crucial about makerspaces that may not be so apparent. So, for instance, she mentions that makerspaces are often associated with things like 3D printers, electronics, etc. She also goes on to mention other things like craft, hardware tools, those sorts of things. So makerspaces can be a multiplicity of things. And in the middle of that definition, that's idea that makerspaces are a place where people can gather to create, invent, and learn, I think really gets at the idea of community, collaboration, and kind of open and shared access, kind of learn together and to create together, that I believe is extraordinarily important with makerspaces. So just to give a little background, in about 2015, the library administration came to a small committee of us and said, you know, would you, investigate where could we maybe put some 3D printers in the library? For those of you thinking, why the library? The library historically has been a place where you can get access to kind of shared tools that might be a little bit more expensive for individuals to get. So we checked out audiovisual equipment. And the library is a site of production. I think particularly 21st century academic libraries, though people's conception of them might be as more of a kind of collection warehouse, it's actually a site of literacy and production, both information literacy, but also now media and now maker literacies. So this was one of the reasons why we were really interested in creating a makerspace. We're also particularly known as kind of a welcoming, neutral, interdisciplinary space on campus. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, but in talking of our planning process. But there may be kind of makerspaces or shops in various colleges for various departments, particular classes, but often those aren't open to everyone. So if you're someone who's just trying to get into making, that is a little bit intimidating if you have to go to engineering and you sort of see all the large, scary equipment and you think, oh, this isn't for me. So particularly if you're trying to encourage women and underrepresented minorities to get involved in making, to get involved in STEM, having a kind of welcoming on-ramp for that kind of activity, I think is really important. So next slide, please. So we started out with that initial charge in about, I think, 2015. Myself, my supervisor, Sarah E. Wright, who's head of our technology, spaces, and learning, and other librarians from both our humanities library and our engineering library, and a variety of other units as well, including our academic technology or Cornell Information Technology, who've been great partners in this. But we came together and said, let's think a little bit more beyond just 3D printing. Like, why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? And the Institute of Museum and Library Services, in our lit review, we found had done a report and was compiling a framework on making and learning. And they particularly emphasized that kind of the tools that people start out thinking about with makerspaces are actually the least important part. The critical pieces are sort of the purpose and the people involved. So what's your mission? Like, what do people on your campus make? What are they trying to do? And then what's your community interested in? Like, who can you get involved? How can you make this a community-driven space? So figuring those things out is actually the critical piece. Next slide, please. So with that, we had an emphasis on user-centered design, doing user studies. The library is particularly a place, I think, that's a good crossroads for kind of finding out, for both informal and formal learning, what is critical for people, what pain points are they running into. We had started with user studies with the renovation of our second floor informal study spaces. We also have classrooms, but in the makerspace, we decided, let's try a design thinking approach. Since this is sort of the large, kind of ill-structured problem that design thinking is really good for. Design thinking, for those who haven't experienced it, the kind of more popular version of that was emphasized by Stanford's Design School. There's a link to some resources there. But basically, it's predicated on beginning with empathy, with a human-centered design process that looks at what are people actually doing. You do interviews, observations, actually see people involved. So we did all of that. And then you kind of define your problem. What are you trying to do? What problem are you trying to solve? Brainstorm, then prototype rapidly solutions, and then test those with actual users. So using that process, next slide, please. We actually came up with what we now call the Manufactory Makerspace. So just to kind of give you an idea of what this is, it's about 1,300 square feet, a makerspace that's dedicated and open to everybody in the Cornell community. So one of the things we found in our design thinking process was that there are shops or makerspaces that are for colleges like art, architecture, and planning, or for particular engineering courses, or a particular kind of rapid prototyping course for information science. But there wasn't an easy on-ramp for anyone to just come in and make things. And some of the other kind of key things we discovered in our design thinking process were that when particularly you're trying to get people who don't think of themselves as makers involved, like often women, minorities, having sort of a welcoming entrance is critical. So we have our information desk, you can sort of see in the top left-hand corner, with our student staff right there and available to say, hi, welcome to the Makerspace. let me show you around with what we have. And then we've put things like our 3D printers, of which we have 6, towards the back. And then we have, before that, just an open workspace where you can see in this picture an actual class is working together collaboratively on their individual projects, but they're all seated around and can quickly get help from someone beside them, as well as the people up front. So that encourages that peer-to-peer learning. To the right, you can sort of see some of the other equipment we have, the 6 3D printers, sewing machines. So having things that are both sort of high-tech and low-tech. We also have things like Legos, yarn, hardware tools, microelectronics kits, so a variety of things. So letting people know, making is a lot of things, and some things that you might already do. So that kind of lowers that barrier. Then we also have, you can see in the bottom left, a bookcase. So displaying projects, letting people know the possibilities. So if they're not familiar with 3D printing, you think, what can you do with it? If you have projects that particularly other students have done, they can see, oh, here are the things that I might want to do. So giving them those ideas. And then we have mobile tables and chairs so people can get together in groups. And then soft seating so that people can maybe have some social space, because making and learning should hopefully be a social process. So that is some of the things that drove our design decisions. So we have particular zones. One of the things you can't see, we also have a VR room that can also do audio and video editing. But the thing besides the space and the tools are the kind of community and the projects that can come out of this. So we've had things like a fiber science student actually get involved in 3D printing to print a drop spindle, something that can spin yarn. So this is a way for people who, like she mostly had worked with knitting and things like that, to give them an on-ramp into sort of the 3D modeling. She also went on to make something with our video tour with our 360 video camera. So giving them that on-ramp that's related to their interests and research into STEM subjects. Also, we are able to encourage young women and young people of color. You can see in sort of the top and then the middle left. Young people, we've done K through 12 workshops, things with cooperative extension. That little girl at the top, we scanned and 3D printed her head. So sometimes it can be just little fun projects that get people interested and hopefully encourage them. It looks like I'm about out of time, but we can chat more about these projects in the future. And on to Sheen.
I'm turning my microphone on. Thank you, Camille. Hi, everybody. And I'm very, very grateful to be a part of this community. And my part is actually very short because I'm giving you a very brief preview about an unconventional learning space the library is trying to bring to Cornell, and it's called the Portal. So Portal has been around and in different places in the United States, and it is a space equipped with immersive audio and video technology. But because many people have not seen it and it comes in different forms, that different forms might be useful to suit your own institution, I'm going to ask Chris to play a video to explain what Portal is and what it does, and then I'll come back to talk briefly why it matters. So Chris, please. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I in a good spot for you guys? Shu small, hide the tambura.
You know, the idea of portals is to create interactions between people who likely otherwise wouldn't meet. We began as a public art project in December of 2014, setting up these big gold shipping containers in Iran and New York, enabling people to converse about daily life. Since then, we've grown to 25 countries, and we are trying to build a global public space where people can interact, talk about daily life, but sing, dance, collaborate, play.
Right now, where we're located is inside a camp for displaced Iraqis. So there's about 1,500 people who had to flee conflict, mainly in Mosul and Sinjar, and they've lived here in this camp for about 2 years.
Opa! ¿Quién es?
The portal space can be used as an educational tool. It's also just quite fun. It's kind of only limited by imagination in terms of the different activities that you can bring into this space.
I didn't realize how real it would feel. I thought it would be like a glorified Skype conversation, but it actually felt like I was in front of that person. I think the portal helps to humanize these conflicts because we get numb and we see, oh, there's displaced people, oh, there's refugees, and we're sad. But to actually be face to face makes you feel like this is really happening, more than just reading it in the paper.
So as you can see, it comes in different forms. And Chris, next slide, please. So what Cornell is planning to do is we're going to rent this portal in a shipping container format for 3 months, starting sometime in the fall of this year. And when I think about the STEM and the topics we talked about just now, many of the STEM issues are global issues, be it public health, be it transportation, be it technology, all to name a few. And if we want our learners to come together to work on solutions for the society, what do the issues look like in Jordan, in Myanmar, in Spain, or Berlin, or United States? And how do women in other countries in different socioeconomic conditions really learn or teach STEM? And what would we talk about these issues and with other women in a lab, in refugee camps, in prison? And how many of us ever had such a conversation live with another human being in different parts, in different conditions? So the goal really is for the library to use the portal to kind of connect faculty, student, and the community outside of Cornell nearby with diverse groups of people. And so we are planning both type of learnings because some of the speakers before me already said learning happens. Some learning are structured in a curriculum-based setting. Others are just spontaneous, coming together to have a conversation. So this is what we are planning to do. So you might ask again, why library? And Camille already answered. We have the universal kind of reputation where we are a safe place, where different people with different background and different needs can come feeling they can learn without being judged by librarians. And we are open to everyone. So this is why we are doing, but we are not doing this alone. On campus, we are collaborating with our Center for Teaching Innovation and also another organization called Engaged Cornell, so that we can collaboratively build this experience and enrich this learning experience of our learners and teaching experience for our faculty through a 3-month experience. So as you can see, it's not yet live, but we are working on it actively right now. And we, the team, would be happy to report back a year from now on the takeaways, the experiences, and so on. So, Chris, if you could advance to the next one. For now, if you want to know more what we are doing, what it is about, and so on, this is the information site that you can access to track where we are going. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Sheen. And we have just about a little over 10 minutes left. And to wrap up, we want to know if anyone in the audience has a question. If you want to come up on stage, we can bring that speaker up. And I know in the chat box, Bennett had asked about how you measure the learning effectiveness of makerspaces. So I'm not sure, Camille, if you want to come back up on stage and address that. I do know I'm working on the portal project with Sheen, and we that is one of the things that we're looking at, is how are we going to measure the experience of students who go into the portal. And so we look forward to reporting back on that. And Camille, I think you're muted. Oh, there you go.
Yes, and that's a very good question. That's something I think that a lot of people are struggling with, in particularly the K through 12 space. There's been some assessment. A lot of the assessment so far has been more qualitative. I did a quick lit review on making literacies and what's been done so far. And it's more case studies, and then kind of qualitative methods. In terms of quantitative methods for that, there's not a lot. There's been a little bit on kind of self-report. So particularly in engineering, in higher education. So asking alums of people who've worked in that space in classes, you know, what has been like your increase in knowledge or confidence in particular, you know, soft skills. In some cases, like measuring, you know, the grades change. But that, I think, is an area that requires a lot more research.
And if you do have a question, please feel free. There is still time to come up on stage and ask it, or to put it in the question box. And we would also love your feedback on the bingo experience. Loved it, didn't like it, anything we can do to make it better next time, because that was the first time that we tried doing that. And if you look just to the side of Kathleen, you can see a box that says Join Podium. So you can feel free to click on that box and just come up on stage and join in the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. And then while we're waiting to see if anyone comes up on stage, Kathleen, do you want to start wrapping us up?
Sure. Thanks again for your attention. We'd like to thank all of our speakers who donated their time and expertise today. We'd also like to thank Chris Downs and the entire Shindig team for hosting and facilitating this online conversation. If this is your first time using Shindig, I hope you come back to the site. We'd also like to especially thank our production team, the people behind the scenes, consisting of Becky Burke, Danica Fisher, and Mary Hennessy, for their contributions in support of this series. So thanks, everybody.
Go ahead, Jean.
I'd just like Chris to go to the last slide on my presentation and give the link to the More Than the Learning Spaces Collaboratory, to the webinar we're having in about 10 days. And it's a webinar on making the case, on how you get the community engaged in thinking about new kinds of learning spaces, build a community. It includes 2 architects and 2 academics. Our webinars always involve a conversation between the architects and academics. And I think of particular interest here, there will be conversations from Joan Lippincott, who's a librarian, who's with the Coalition for Networked Information. The story from Colorado State, where they've just built a new innovation center, and after it took 64 conversations bringing the community together. And so the other 2 are about kind of increasing interdisciplinary learning spaces. So I invite you to connect to the LSC and join us for that. And I'm going to put some of the rest of my tale that I prepared and wish to share with you in another venue. Thank you very much.
Right.
Thank you, Jeannie.
Thanks. Yep. And it looks like the link is not on that last slide. So Jeannie, if you want, you could put the link in the chat box, but we can also send it out to everyone that that has registered for this session. And as I mentioned earlier, we will send the PowerPoints out also to everyone that's registered. So you have the PowerPoints and any links. And you can also throw it on Twitter with the hashtag STEM Students Thrive. And with that, I would like to remind everyone that our next session is February 14th on Valentine's Day, and it will be the same time, 12 to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And the topic for that will be introductory undergraduate STEM courses. And we have Jay Labov from the National Research Council, Catherine Middlecamp from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Liesl Folks from University at Buffalo, and Michael Fontaine from Cornell University. So we hope that you can join us for that. And if you have missed some of the previous sessions, there are recordings of the sessions. I believe that Robin shared a link to the Facebook page on Twitter. So you can go there if you'd like to review any of the others, and please spread the word. We were thrilled that we had 76 people attend today. So thank you very much for your time. And if anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to jump up and let us know. Hi, Richard.
Rich.
Thanks for joining us. I see a nice Syracuse hat on you.
What's that?
I like
Can
your
you hear me?
Syracuse hat. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it's not Syracuse. Well, this was really great. And Jeannie and Lisa, Rebecca, and Camille and Sheen, thank you so much. I'm Rich Holton from Stanford. I've worked on the learning space rating system that Lisa so nicely described. And I just would throw out there that we struggled with the learning space rating system too. We tried to recognize that we need to have this idea of inclusion and building, designing spaces to be inclusive. And what we struggled with is, what does that mean as a best practice? And so I've been jotting down ideas through this whole thing today. If anybody has ideas, we would love to hear them about how would you articulate a best practice for designing spaces to be inclusive. And so I think we know more about what not to do, the kind of language not to put in a space and the kind of things to avoid, to say who's included when you walk into a space. I mean, there's obvious things about language and gender and so on that say, oh, you're included and you're not included. But beyond that, asserting things to do, I think is more complex and more difficult. So, any specific ideas of how do you design a space? I mean, Camille was talking about how to make some specific tie-ins, a welcome area that is friendly to lowering barriers for certain populations. So stuff like that, if people have ideas, how do we integrate that? Anybody who's looked at the learning space rating system, we'd love to how would we assign a point, a credit in the learning space rating system for doing specific things, and what would those be? So thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
That's a great question, Richard. Thank you. And I see Camille put a few links into the chat box. The people that are in the room with her can see. And Camille, if you want to put that on Twitter with the hashtag STEM Students Thrive, that would be great. And then we can also add that to the information that we send out when we share it, the PowerPoints and other information. And with that, if no one else has any questions, I think it will be about time to wrap up.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your attention.